Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency in the Peter S. Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs. So much easier when you just do the hyperlink, right? And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today for the 2025 Lives in Public Policy and Public Service Address. Hofstra started this lecture series, I see so many familiar faces, in the spring of 2017, shortly after we created the Kalikow School and the Public Policy and Public Service, PPPS, for those of us in the know, major. The purpose, and it was developed by several faculty in this room, actually, of this lecture series, was to bring policy practitioners to campus to bridge the study of policymaking from idea development, interest groups, outside influences, institutional choices, to policy implementation, comparative studies, U.S. policymaking in the world, questions about ethics and choices, with policymaking in practice. And we have continued this address annually many times with Hofstra alumni, and that has been particularly special for us because so many of our alumni are actively engaged in multiple forms of public service, and whether it be through interest groups, working in elected office, legislative staff, agencies, and for the first time, we are bringing back an alum who is really intersects the study of policy with practice through working at a think tank, and that is Mr. Matthew LaCourte. I'm going to give a full introduction in a moment. Let me just thank, I know we have 5 classes here today. We have Professor Nanis's Writing Studies class. We have Dr. Burnett's Introduction to Public Policy and Public Service. We have Dr. Baer's Law, Philosophy, and Public Life. We have Professor Feldman's American Politics course. And we have Professor Libresco's Introduction to Civic Engagement. It is wonderful to have all of you here today. We have the Dean of the Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Eva Badowska. Thank you, Eva, for joining us. And we have many other faculty, students, guests. It is truly a delight to have you here with us today. Now, let me move on to our speaker. Matthew LaCourte is the Deputy Director of Immigration Policy at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. Matthew leads the Immigration Department's legislative outreach for Niskanen, and his areas of focus include DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, program that was instituted by executive action by President Obama in 2012 and has survived legal challenges, is currently is halted, but still in existence at the moment. Matthew also focuses on employment and family visas and refugee resettlement, clearly topics that are very much in the news today. He has written extensively about immigration policy for the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Financial Times, and his research in immigration has been cited in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Public Radio, pretty much every major national and international news outlets. Now, where did Matthew develop his expertise? Policy, writing, analysis? Well, 14 years ago, Matthew was a student in many events in the Cultural Center Theater. He was a political science major. He minored in economics. He took classes with, I think, many of the faculty in this room, including, I know he took Philosophy 15. He took the 2012 seminar on the race for the White House with me. He was here for the 2012 presidential debate. I believe you were in the arena, Matthew. And Matthew has given so generously of his time and expertise to Hofstra since he graduated. Dr. Parati has pointed out that he has attended, I think, pretty much every alumni gathering in Washington, D.C. Some of you have had, that's part of the annual trip to Washington that the Political Science Department and the Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences organize. Some of you heard Matthew speak this morning in different classes. Today, Matthew is going to share with us in this talk his journey from studying politics and economics to moving to Washington, D.C., initially as a student intern and then full-time, and to going from lobbying advocacy to policy development. In addition to his degree at Hofstra, he completed a 2-week Public Affairs and Advocacy Institute program at American University. And I should have said, his work on immigration policy started with an honors project with Dr. Parati, and I was delighted to serve on his thesis defense committee. I think we said it was the spring of 2015. So we typically do not, when we invite alums for this talk, we wait until a decade until they graduated. We figured that was close enough. We're within 3 months, and we didn't want to have you all come back in June. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Matthew LaCourte back to Hofstra.
All right, hey everybody. This is quite a thrill for me to be back. I attended a lot of events in this theater, and with such a packed room. It's really an honor, Professor Bose. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So many professors that I had when I was younger and probably had more hair, but still not that much hair. It's just so great to be back. We've had a lovely morning. We had a lovely dinner last night. The professors here have always meant so much to me, so it's just great. I loved my time at Hofstra. The last time I was here was the Obama conference in 2023. Which was a great time. I was able to just hang out and kind of walk around and take in the sights and sounds. The presidential conferences that go on here are amazing, and the Bush conference from my time in 2015. I love connecting with alumni, so I'll say this at the start. Whenever I speak to classes, I say, please email me. I'm happy to chat about politics, about policy, about immigration, about think tanks, about career stuff. I'm happy to work with Hofstra students and give out internships and things like that. So I legitimately mean, email me, and I'm happy to chat and for us to become friends and partners as alum. I want to do a couple things today. I'm going to discuss my journey from Hofstra to Washington. I also want to provide some context for what is happening in the immigration space. It's been a very active last 6 weeks, and so I just want to talk a little bit about what is happening, the issues that I'm paying attention to, and kind of what I see coming down in the coming weeks. And then I want to talk a little bit about just some words of wisdom and how students can approach public policy and public policy careers. So my journey at Hofstra started in fall of 2011, which feels like a very long time ago. I came to Hofstra because Hofstra had the 2008 presidential debate, which was a huge deal. I'm from New Jersey, and over in Jersey that was a thing. And my parents allowed me to be about an hour away for college, so it all seemed to work out to come to Hofstra. The only school that I applied to, I was telling the professor that this morning, kind of came to Hofstra and loved it, and then obviously had a great experience. In middle school and high school, I was really interested in politics. I was like, that kid that wanted to debate and talk about everything and whatnot. When I got to Hofstra, I was really libertarian. I was a very radical libertarian in my undergrad. I was very dogmatic. I was looking for debates in class and conversations. one of the first things I did on campus was start a libertarian student group. We had the college Democrats and we had the college Republicans, and I was looking for some sort of alternative, third party, and I started the college Libertarians, and I was involved in that group for all 4 years that I was here. I then did the radio station and TNL and some other things, which was a great time. But my time in the kind of political science world, meant the most to me while at Hofstra. In the spring semester of my junior year, I decided to intern in Washington, D.C. And so I went down on actually my 21st birthday. I got on a train in Newark, New Jersey, an Amtrak to Washington, and moved into a cramped apartment on Capitol Hill. I actually had a bunk bed my first semester interning, which was like ridiculous. And I was interning at a think tank, and I was studying things like transportation policy and tax policy, and I just wasn't being moved by what I was working on. I was interested in politics, but I didn't have like a policy that I was really passionate about. And then I was given an assignment to work on an immigration issue, and I just kind of fell in love with it. I just kept looking for more opportunities to kind of study immigration. I saw it through three different lenses. Me and my family have our own immigration story, like many of the people in this room, and I was interested in that a kind of 150-year history in my own life. There's a history piece. There's a policy piece. There's so many different aspects to immigration policy. I think we hear a lot about the border, and we hear about immigration enforcement, mass deportation, but there's so much more in the immigration policy space, and I just wanted to learn about all 90 plus visa types and different ways to come to the U.S. and the history of immigration policy in America. And then the third piece that really moved me was the politics. So this was a time when the United States Senate was debating this big immigration bill. It was going to be a generational comprehensive immigration reform package. The Senate passed that bill in a bipartisan way. The House was considering picking up an immigration bill and moving it. Ultimately, they decided not to do that. And what became clear to me was the policy is one thing, but the politics, like how do you actually move a bill forward in the process and get it over the finish line and get permanent change to be made. That it became clear to me that is what was moving me. At that point, I didn't know it, but it was government affairs, it was lobbying, it was less on the policy side and more on the how do you like move an agenda forward. That is what kind of energized me. So I was in DC for 9 months, 2 different internships, had a great time, very formidable experience in my life. And I came back to Hofstra, and I knew I needed to dive more into immigration. And so I started a independent study with Dr. Parati on immigration. We were trying to find ways, like how do you move this immigration conversation forward? And Dr. Parati was saying you need to find a bridging solution. You need to bridge the left and the right. How do we have a cooperation between the parties? This may not include the far right or the far left, but how do we take folks in the middle? How do we create an immigration policy that we can move through Congress and ultimately reform the immigration system, a system that's broken, a system that the last time we really updated, none of the students in this room, neither am I, we were not alive when the Congress last updated our immigration laws. That's ridiculous, right? That's preposterous. And so obviously we need as a country to come together and modernize this system. A system that was created in 1986 or 1990 is not a workable system in 2025. And really the system was created in 1965. And so that's a long time ago. So I came back to DC, to Hofstra. I was working with Dr. Parati on this thesis, trying to find the questions to how do we get through this federal gridlock? And really, it's a project that I have worked on for the last 10 years. It started in Dr. Parati's office, and it continues really every day with my work at Niskanen in Washington, D.C., which is really trying to find solutions to pressing public policy issues and moving them forward in a bipartisan way. So I was in a spring semester, senior year, 1-credit gym class, just trying to finish it out, a little senioritis, and I got a call from a friend that I had in DC that he was starting a new think tank and wanted to, was looking for somebody to do immigration research. and I was just like begging for a job at this point. So I had a job offer. I was moving down to DC, and I was ready to take on immigration in a professional 9-to-5 way, and that was thrilling and amazing. And 10 years later, I'm still at the same organization working on the same issue. The politics are trickier today than they were in 2015, but really more needed today than ever is to find a solution to immigration. So I want to shift to talking about the kind of state of immigration policy. The last 2 months have been very active in the immigration policy space, and I kind of want to talk through some of those developments. And I'll start by saying this. I've been working on immigration for 10 years. I have a staff of 6 in Washington. Every day it is a full-time job for us to kind of assess all that is happening with the federal government at the moment. And so what I would say to the students is, if it's hard to try to assess all that is happening in this moment, to take stock of the changes to immigration, to the federal workforce, to other issues, there's just a lot going on. And I think we're all trying to take the pace of politics at the moment and be able to take as much from it. It's hard to make sense of everything, and hopefully I can try to do some of that today. So I think to start in talking about the last 2 months, really need to go back to the election. The lesson that I took from the election in the immigration context is that the American people really don't like the notion of chaos at the border or chaos anyway through the immigration system. They really want to know, they really want the government to know who is coming to the border, who those people are, who is in our cities, and have a sense of control over the process of immigration. News footage of people coming over the border or migrants in city shelters in places like New York City, I think did enormous damage to President Biden electorally. And I think it did a lot of damage to the general support for immigration in the country. I still think the majority of people probably in this room, the majority of Americans, see immigration as a benefit and not a burden, see that immigrants contribute to our country. But want to make sure that the process of immigration, is easy to understand, it is controlled, and ultimately it is safe and secure. And I think that is not that's not out of the question. That is what we should expect from our government. However, the Democratic Party's perceived weakness on immigration obviously was a factor that led to the election of Donald Trump, and I think anyone interested in the immigration conversation needs to confront that as a reality. So how do we understand kind of where we're at 2 months in? Just some updates. First, the border right now, the situation at the border, which was such an influential part of this election, it is very quiet. It's the apprehension numbers are as low as they have been since COVID. And so really the conversation about immigration has moved from the border to the interior of the country. We're not talking about asylum seekers as much as now we're talking about undocumented immigrants that are in the U.S. Second, the mass deportation effort that Donald Trump campaigned on has not materialized yet, but that does not mean it's not going to materialize. So arrests are up. Deportations are about at the same level as they were under the last year of President Biden. The latest data reveals that about 45% of those in immigration detention at the moment are non-criminals. They have no criminal conviction or pending charges. 45% have criminal convictions. 55% do not have criminal convictions. And so I think there's widespread support for the notion of deporting criminal undocumented immigrants in the United States. I think there is a lot less public support for arresting and deporting those who are picked up at a traffic stop or have no criminal convictions whatsoever. And third, I think something that's really interesting and that is very new, immigration enforcement has perhaps become one of the administration, the federal government's biggest priorities. We've never really seen a whole of government approach to immigration enforcement. This has never been tested. We have the Department of Defense, the State Department, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security have never focused as many resources as they are right now in trying to do immigration enforcement. The administration has actually deprioritized white-collar investigations in favor of immigration enforcement. This is unprecedented. The use of the military when it comes to immigration enforcement and deportation, it has never been tried. It costs 3 times as much to deport an immigrant on a military flight as it would on an ICE flight. And so this use of the federal government, the use of the DOD, I think that we're struggling to find a justification for getting the military involved in immigration enforcement when we have an entire agency, ICE, that is dedicated to immigration enforcement. And finally, there is this attempt to pull legal status from hundreds of thousands of people who currently have a legal status, potentially up to 1 million. Right now, there's about 13.5 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. The number is going to go up by hundreds of thousands as the Trump administration is looking to cancel a couple different programs. Number one, something called Temporary Protected Status, TPS. This was in the news a lot during the election. TPS exists if you are in the United States, maybe you came here on a tourist visa, and there was a natural disaster, a coup, some sort of event that happened in your country, and you're not able to return to that country. And so we give you temporary protected status. This is countries like Haiti, Syria. Those countries, the nationals from those countries are able to stay in the U.S. That's hundreds of thousands of people, and the Trump administration has started to cancel those work permits and legal statuses, so those people would become subject to deportation when their status runs out. And then we have programs like humanitarian parole, especially for 4 different populations: Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. That's another group of hundreds of thousands of different undocumented of immigrants who are going to become undocumented if they pull back those protections, and that's something that we could expect to see in the coming months. All that's subject to litigation, like everything else in the immigration space. We'll see what the courts have to say, but that is something to keep in mind as well. There's a lot more to say. There is a one-pager that went around. There's some more information there about things like refugee resettlement, the H-1B, the reconciliation process. There's a lot there. I'm happy to get into all of that in the Q&A, and hope folks stay after if they want to ask questions as well. So all that's to say, well, what is a viable immigration policy then that we should be pursuing? What can stand in contrast to the current Trump administration? What could stand in contrast to the Biden administration? Here's a few ideas. One, just 1/3 of asylum applicants, these are people who come into the U.S. and are seeking asylum, are granted asylum by the end of the process. Right, three-fourths of those people are ultimately denied asylum. We need to find ways to quickly resolve an asylum process that for some people can take up to 10 years at this point. That doesn't work that doesn't work to help anyone. We need to be granting asylum to people quickly, or we need to be rejecting them quickly. But either way, the idea that we can have an immigration system where someone's in a limbo status for up to 10 years on whether or not they're going to be able to stay in this country, that doesn't help the system, it doesn't help the immigrants, it doesn't help our communities. We need to reduce chaos at the border, but at the same time, we need to be drastically increasing legal immigration in ways that materially help the American people. So I mentioned earlier, the last time that we really changed our immigration laws was 1990. The population was a lot smaller. The economy looked a lot different. The world was a different place. The idea that we don't have to update our immigration quotas over 30, 40 years, I think is ridiculous. We need to find new pathways for the modern economy, and we need to utilize immigration as a strategy for economic growth. We need to address key industries that are facing shortages. We need to use immigration for diplomacy. We need to find ways to create legal immigration that's streamlined, that's fair, that makes sure we're getting the people that we want, and also at the same time reducing chaos at the border and deporting criminals who shouldn't be in the country anymore. If you're interested in that project, come intern for me in Washington, and let's work on it together. Some words of wisdom for public policy students. When I got to Hofstra, I was like a serious libertarian, really radical, really dogmatic, and I think I've shifted a lot in some of those views. And I think it's okay to change your mind, and you should be able to change your mind, and I would encourage folks to accept when there's information that you're getting that makes you want to change your mind, to go with that. There's lots of times in your lives where you can move to the left or you can move to the right. I don't think that you should be like, I am this political persuasion today and I'm going to be that way for the rest of my life. You're able to change your mind, and I think people changing their mind is healthy in a democracy. 2, in public policy and in lobbying, I think it's always better to be for something than against everything. If there's a problem and then someone has a solution, and maybe you don't agree with that solution, you should try to come up with another solution. There's, I think, too many people in Washington are just trying to oppose everything. And if you really want to be helpful and you really want to be influential, you can, instead of opposing something, find something else to support and then try to push that as far as you can push it. Number 3, Hofstra has a political science, a public policy tradition that I think you all should be proud of. I'm proud of it, but you also all can contribute to. So we have former senators, we have Congress people, we have top White House advisors, lobbyists, professors, think tankers, organizers, Hill staffers in D.C. We have a great alumni group in D.C., but also outside of D.C. I think we want, as alumni, for you all to go on and graduate, those interested in political science, public policy, to become part of that tradition. We want to welcome you all into that. So if you're down in DC, reach out to the alumni network. We all want to help you all in your journey. I think the thing about Hofstra that's been pretty amazing, all these professors could have forgotten about me 10 years ago and sent me off. I graduated and I did the little cap and gown thing and it was over. But they've all stayed in my life and they've all supported me and they wanted to see me succeed. And I don't think you have that at every school you go to. So there's a network here and it's kind of beautiful. And I welcome you all into that lineage. Finally, on the title of this lecture series, I've always liked to tell myself, maybe I've watched too much of The West Wing, but that what I'm doing is public service and it's not politics. Politics is kind of like a little dirty. Public service is rewarding and kind of beautiful. I've never had a government job. I'm not a public servant in the traditional sense, but I think what I'm trying to do and my colleagues are trying to do is public service. We're trying to be stewards for our country and for institutions that really matter. And that's something that I think we all can take pride in. So public service, not politics. Thank you for listening. A lot more to get into, and I look forward to a robust Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Before we move into audience Q&A, Dr. Parati and I are going to lead a conversation with our speaker to delve into some more of these details. And I think, Dr. Parati, I'll let you ask the first question.
I'm going to ask an immigration policy related question. I'm sure that many of you are going to ask about career and career paths. But we've been talking a lot in my classes about presidential power. The president uses the imagery of an invasion and refers to national security risks to justify actions on immigration. Most recently with detaining migrants at Guantanamo Bay. What do his communications and recent decisions indicate, particularly about the power of the president vis-a-vis Congress? Remember, the Constitution gives Congress the power to make law regarding naturalization, immigration. So what does this imagery of invasion have to do with his construction of his power under the Constitution?
Yeah, great question, important question, especially given so much that we're seeing out of this administration so far. Here's what I would say. The president has enormous power when it comes to immigration, right? The traditional kind of textbook version of this is that Congress has the power. The president can make some changes, and then the judiciary would be able to approve or reject some of those changes. We've really seen Congress abdicate its responsibility on immigration and other issues, but on immigration policy in the last 20 years or so, right? As I've said previously, we haven't passed a major immigration reform bill since the 90s. Every time that this has been attempted, it's scuttled somehow. And I think because of that, there's just been enormous ground ceded to the executive. And this really started with President Obama. This continued with President Trump, continued with President Biden, and then now we're back on a second go around with President Trump. And the Congress has let it happen. I think that there is a huge appetite for us to do pretty large-scale immigration reform in this country in a lot of ways. Enforcement, change the asylum system, change the way that families can sponsor immigrants, change the way that employers can bring immigrants to this country. And instead, almost every single thing has to come through the White House and the Department of Homeland Security. And I think we've just elevated the role of the president and then the courts, and the Congress almost has no role. And so I think we see this kind of ping-ponging back and forth where the first month of the Trump administration, they're canceling all the things that the Biden administration did. Well, if you went back 4 years, the first month of the Biden administration, they were canceling all the things that the Trump administration did. The only entity really that can provide long-term overhaul of the immigration system is Congress, and Congress is just not in the game at the moment. They're on the sidelines. And so you're going to have the opportunity for the Supreme Court to make rulings on things like DACA, things like birthright citizenship, and that's going to have enormous implications for the future of our immigration system. But they're not the kind of long-term modernization of the system that only Congress can provide. And so we're kind of stuck in this, like, we look at language that Congress, passed in 1980 or 1965 or 1952, and we're trying to parse out, oh, well, maybe this word means this, and that means we can do this program. I guess we'll see what the court says about it. It's like not the way to do immigration policy. It's not the way to do public policy. And so we just need a Congress that's like ready to do some stuff. And I think what I'm interested in doing is working with Congress on like the challenging negotiations to try to move something, really anything forward at this point, to make some permanent changes that can stick and create a system that is fair, that people have expectations for how the system is going to look, and ultimately bring the system into the 21st century.
If I can ask a follow-up, Matthew, over the course of today and in your remarks just now, you present almost kind of realistic optimism that there is a path forward. And that's encouraging, that you see a pathway to legislation. But in a time, and it's not just 2025, this dates back at least a decade, if not more, there has been a very, very strong hardline restrictionist position on immigration policy in this country, and other think tanks, not Niskanen, but others have argued for absolutist. If someone is in the country without documented status, no exceptions, right? No pathway to citizenship, nothing, and that view is reflected in members with elected officials, right? Sure. And to a certain degree in the White House, I would say. What do you think? How do you navigate the policymaking landscape when you're addressing interests that kind of take an absolutist approach?
Tricky question. So I think that there is a story to tell that's more optimistic about what is possible. That optimism can be me being naive at the same time. Like, I want to find a way to have optimism, but that to be grounded in reality. Optimism just for the sake of like, oh, we're going to pass a huge immigration bill. That doesn't help anybody. So I think what I'm always trying to do is balance what I think is possible and what history says. History says that we're not doing immigration reform this year because we haven't done it for the last 40 years. So why would this year be any different? I think what your question is getting at is the other side of that, which is if you want to be pessimistic about the state of immigration advocacy today, there's enormous power right now concentrated in the Republican Party in folks who don't want any large-scale major bipartisan effort. They want to see restrictions made to the legal immigration system. They want to see enforcement conducted in the interior. They want to see like little to no immigration in the U.S. They see immigration as a burden, not a benefit. And I think that view is wrong, in my opinion. but very popular at the highest levels of the White House, and something that is very hard to kind of navigate around. What I would say is we're expecting, Supreme Court hearing potentially on DACA in the coming years, on birthright citizenship in the coming years, the potential for the Congress to give enormous amounts of money for something like mass deportation. I think what we learn in politics is that nothing ever is totally stagnant. And so I think what we have at the moment is very little daylight and optimism on what we can get done in the next couple months. But if you put yourself a year from today, we're a year into the second Trump administration. We are a couple months away from a midterm election. We've already seen polling data that suggests that the president's approval rating is dropping, disapproval rating going up. With Supreme Court litigation, the kind of conditions of bipartisan cooperation don't exist today, but they could always exist tomorrow. And there's always either a Supreme Court case that could change that conversation. There is a tragedy that could unlock that conversation. I think there is a before and after the murder of Laken Riley, this young woman in Georgia, that changed the politics of immigration. In 2018, the family separation policy from the Trump administration had enormous a change in public opinion and opinion on the Hill about immigration. And so I think we're always one tweet, one day, 6 months away from shaking up that snow globe a little bit, as Professor Bear likes to say. And when the political conditions change, maybe that's an opportunity. History tells us that opportunity is not going to result in 218 votes in the House and 60 votes in the Senate. But part of my job every day is to wake up and be like, all right, we're gonna do this thing. What does the thing look like? Maybe that's naivete in some way, but I remain optimistic. I'm almost always optimistic that a window is coming, and maybe that window is in 2027, but there is a window, and what I want to be prepared for whenever that window opens. So have what I want the Congress to do, have the parameters of the debate, have the ideas already ready to go. So when that window opens, we're able to exploit that opportunity.
That's optimistic. So that's good to hear. I don't want to be pessimistic.
Yeah.
I mean, especially given that every couple of years we have this conversation, and I say, well, how are you doing?
Yeah.
And you're saying, I'm almost ready to throw in the towel.
Yeah.
And I think, it's only going to be a few more months for him. But then something happens, and he picks the ball back up again. I want to just kind of press this question of what's the deal going forward. There was a bipartisan bill that almost made it in Congress, but we know that the Republican candidate for president put the kibosh on that. And my expectation was that the kibosh is being put on that because we have something better planned for the future, or we want to take credit for the cooperation that's going to happen in the future. But we haven't seen that yet. I wonder what the possible contours of a deal between restrictionists and immigration liberals might be.
Well, it's a big question. I think if you have the answer to that, you can move to Washington and make a lot of money. I think it is very unclear what that looks like right now, but there's some. I think we have an impression of what that could look like. So the deal used to be we were going to do border enforcement and we were going to do legalization or regularization. So we were going to say we're going to close down the border, we're going to dedicate all this money to doing border enforcement, we're going to deport a lot of people. Simultaneously, we're going to give a legal status to those that don't have status, the undocumented population. Both sides are going to have to give something they don't want. Both sides are going to get something that they do want. We're able to come together. That's the parameters of the deal. We'll figure out the details, and we're good to go. We kind of tried that many, many times. What was different about 2024 was there was an effort to do a border security bill without any legalization or regularization. It was all border security. And so the parameters of the deal have fallen apart. The deal now was just one-sided. And almost every single Democrat did vote for that bill. So the politics have really shifted compared to where they've been in the last 10, 20, 30 years on the kind of parameters of a grand bargain is kind of the term. I think a new bargain exists. I don't think we know what it looks like yet, but I think it's out there. It probably has to do with the Dreamers, right? The DACA program that President Obama created that's been caught in litigation for 13 years now. That's about 500,000 people who came to the U.S. as children. Their parents brought them to the U.S. They had no role in making that decision. They were 5 years old. Their parents brought them to America. They are protected from deportation. The Supreme Court might say that program is illegal, and that would, as it has in the last couple of years, that would create kind of a huge fight in Congress about, all right, what do we do with these folks? Now, most people, right, left, and center, agree that, well, we have to protect the Dreamers. The Dreamers should stay. They literally don't know any other country but the United States. For the most part, those people have to stay. Well, if that's one side of the equation, the other side is probably not border security anymore, considering that all the moves that President Trump has made on border security on his own, and the Republicans in Congress are trying to use reconciliation, which is this special legislative process to do their own border bill. So maybe it's not that. Maybe it is reform of the asylum system. And I think when you start to put some of these pieces together, DACA, reforming asylum, and then probably a conversation about what it looks like for family members to sponsor their family in the U.S., you probably have the three legs of the stool, or what you would say, of a negotiation. Whether that gets you over the finish line, huge question, probably not. But I think the parameters are shifting, and what think tanks and advocacy groups like mine are thinking about and looking to do is like, how do we shape the parameters of that, and what can we do now to kind of get ourselves in a place where we can be helpful to members of Congress negotiating about what the new debate looks like in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the line.
Let me just pick up with that point, actually, about how Niskanen and how the center influences the policy debate, and your group in particular. Because in academia, where we are here in the classroom, right, we're a little removed. And academia we have the luxury of time, right, of space, of hopefully civil conversation and dialogue, but we're a little removed, right? And academia gets criticized for being the ivory tower, so to speak, right? Fairly or unfairly. But, for a think tank that's based in Washington, D.C. in particular, do you find, Matthew, that your influence or potential influence is much closer in the policymaking process, and in what ways?
Yeah, I think we're a lot closer. I think, first of all, one of the reasons I love coming back here is I do think stepping back into the ivory tower gives you a lens and an ability to kind of see things that being up close, kind of being in the front row, where I'm blind to. I'm not able to see some of those things. I think my day-to-day is like what has happened at 9 a.m. and can we respond to that by 2 o'clock or the next day? And I think when you are closer to something, you kind of can't maybe see it for what it is. And so I love coming back and engaging with academics in learning about what they're seeing from maybe a different vantage point, and then how that can shift tactics or strategy or ideas. What we're trying to do, and what your run-of-the-mill advocacy organization in D.C. is looking to do, is provide what we call legislative subsidy. So, members of Congress, they have like, in the House, I think what is like an average of like 700,000 constituents each or something like that. Senators have a much larger number. And they have a pretty small staff, like a shockingly small staff of folks in the House in order to do all of the work for a member of Congress. I mean, some of these offices are like 20 people. It's shocking. And so what they're looking for is they're kind of looking for help from folks outside of their office, outside of Capitol Hill. And the nefarious side of that is you have your smoke-filled back rooms with lobbyists from questionable outfits and there's the image of a DC lobbyist and they're kind of filling that gap. But really that is happening, sure. But really there's just a ton of people, thousands of organizations in DC that are trying to provide assistance to members of Congress, their staff, administrative agencies, the White House. You guys should be doing this. You should be paying attention to this. How can we help you with this thing? Do you have questions about what this looks like? And it's that kind of day-to-day interaction with a member of Congress and their staff where influence comes in, where you're able to say, where a staffer is able to come to you and say, we want to introduce this bill. How do we go about that? Where do we start? Who would you talk to? How would you think about writing this complicated section? It's those types of things. It's a legislative subsidy that advocacy groups and think tanks are looking to provide. And that's where we kind of get our influence from, those who are able to provide the best information, forge the best relationships, and ultimately help members of Congress that they see as allies move an agenda forward from thinking about what a bill could look like to trying to get as many votes as possible for that bill. And so I think we're very close. We're maybe too close. Texting with Hill staffers, Zooming constantly up on the Hill for folks who are in Washington D.C. That I think we get a little lost, and that sometimes trying to take that step back and talking to folks with perspective, like your professors here, gives you a different vantage point. And I need that as a lobbyist to be able to see what can Professor Parati tell me about how this debate went in 1992? That is really important information for me to have, and I kind of can't get that in the day-to-day churn of Washington D.C. and the tweets and the newsletters and the chaos.
Okay, well that's reassuring, right? I think maybe Dr. Parati and I will each ask one more question, and then we'll open it up because I know we'll have a lot here.
I'm going to ask a specific question about refugee admissions because it's important. Here goes. The refugee admissions process was effectively halted by President Trump when he came into office, and he wants to restructure it. What are the Trump administration's complaints about the current refugee admissions process? Can that be structured unilaterally? What does it mean to end the refugee admissions process in the United States?
Yeah, so there's been a ton of attention on what's happening at the southern border, and these are asylum seekers seeking kind of refuge in the United States and claiming that they're persecuted on the basis of religion, sex, gender, political opinion, etc. The same legal standard applies to a different group of people called refugees. And refugees have that same legal standard, but they are outside of the country. They're not at the border. They're not inside the interior of the U.S. They are in Afghanistan, and they are leaving Afghanistan because they worked with members of the U.S. military, and they fled to Pakistan. They are in Syria. They are in somewhere like Venezuela, a place where they're being persecuted for one of those 5 protected grounds. We've resettled something like 3.6 million refugees since 1980. It's a small but pivotal part of our immigration system with enormous implications for foreign policy and diplomacy. And President Trump tried to shut down the refugee program his first term in office. And he was arguing then that there were terrorist concerns about a kind of faulty refugee program that lets in people without securely vetting them. Right now, in the first week of office, President Trump has issued an executive order suspending indefinitely the refugee program, this time arguing that it's not in the national interest, and also arguing that the border crisis brought so many people to the U.S. that we don't have the capacity to do refugee resettlement anymore. I would disagree with that position. I think the refugee program is a really important piece of the U.S. immigration system. But the president has basically complete authority to increase or decrease the number of refugees we admit every year. Every year he submits a report to Congress. That report says we're going to resettle X number of refugees. He has to consult the Congress. The consultation is really just like checking a box. President Trump reduced refugee admissions to 11,000 in 2020. President Biden brought refugee admissions to 100,000 last year, the highest number in 30 years. But the president can do whatever they want on refugee issues. And I think they have made an argument the first term and now this term that refugee resettlement is not, they're not interested in a refugee program. And I think it is incumbent on groups like mine and others to be making the case that any sort of foreign policy, we need to be protecting those who are fighting for human rights, those who are persecuted individuals. And there's so many instances of refugees. The case of the Afghans is enormously consequential at the moment, but there are literally tens of thousands of Afghans who helped the U.S. military. They are now being, tracked down and persecuted by the Taliban. And for the U.S. to just let those people, be targeted and ultimately killed by the Taliban is ridiculous when they were working for the United States. And so the refugee program, while it's compassionate and it's charitable, and I think it's an important part of kind of who we are as Americans, it's also really strategically important. We don't have an existing refugee program at the moment, and a report is going to be issued every 90 days from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, on whether or not it's in the national interest to bring that program back. And we will be issuing a similar report arguing that it is in the national interest and it helps U.S. interests at home and abroad.
We're going to move to questions in about 2 minutes, and we'd like to give priority to students. So if people want to start coming up, that would be great. I'll ask a question as people start thinking about the questions they might want to ask. Matthew, you've referred to the tweets, the Zooms, I don't think you referred to TikToks, but we know there are plenty of those,
Sure, yeah.
right? And not to mention the commentaries, the policy papers, the books, the articles. How do you keep up with the news on immigration today? And perhaps maybe just as importantly, how do you assess the validity of the information that you see? There is so much out there.
Yeah.
And so how do you examine it, process it, perhaps even decide what to respond to?
Yeah, great question, important question. I think right now things are moving so fast that it's hard to stay up to date on the news. And in my line of work, like I want to know everything that's happening almost as it is happening. And so it's impossible not to be on Twitter at this point, just to get the kind of constant hour by hour download of what is happening in Washington. I think staying informed for me at this point, I've subscribed to a lot of newsletters. So there's the kind of New York Times and Politicos and Punch Bowls of the world that send out like a daily or multiple times a day newsletter that's kind of a digest of like, here's everything that's happened in the last 24 hours. And I would be lost without people trying to curate all of that information, both in the immigration context, immigration-specific newsletters and emails, and then in the wider context of just all the news. And then I think there's a bunch of reputable, very credible organizations that put out really high-quality stuff. I was telling a class earlier today about the Migration Policy Institute, MPI, that does some world-class research on immigration. And then there's a lot of experts, journalists, folks in the think tank space, former government officials that I think have a great perspective, and I trust the information that they're putting forward and following their work, whether it's on social media or their written work, I think is really important just to stay updated and in the know on all that is happening. And to be able to put it all together, you can know that there's something happening on refugee resettlement, birthright citizenship, H-1Bs, and TPS. But it's like the vantage point thing I was saying, like, well, if you take a step back, you're like, okay, I have all this information, but like, if you put all of that in context of what is the overarching takeaway from all these things in unison, I think is something that is difficult at the moment, and we're trying to all assess like putting the whole puzzle together, and not just like a little part here and a little part there. When there's so much coming at you, that is a kind of it's like a 9 to 5 just to keep up with the news at this point. And I think that's also kind of some of the point from the White House.
Thank you. Well, you can see that we have questions, so let's open up the discussion, please.
First of all, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. Just a quick question. So my family and I moved here from Pakistan in 2011, and I remember the process being very difficult just growing up around that. But I do also know that it took about 12 years to actually get citizenship. So I was just kind of wondering, what kind of conversations do you have within your think tank, and just to speed up that process, the process of asylum, and just kind of getting everything ready and going, and how can we make that process a little bit faster and a bit easier on families specifically?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we have an incredibly inefficient immigration system in this country, whether it's the asylum process, which could take 10 years, whether it's applying for naturalization, which can take a very long time. We have all these quotas in our immigration system, quotas for regions of the world, quotas for certain countries. We have quotas within quotas about different things. And I think you have the experience of of going through. Wow, this is taking forever. It's really complicated. It's expensive. You need to hire a lawyer. All these things. We have a really convoluted immigration system with quotas set in the 1990s that have led to backlogs, which mean people are waiting 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, if you're trying to come to the U.S. and you have family, you're trying to be sponsored through the family program. And you're from China, India, Mexico, you could be waiting literally decades for your spot in line to come up. And that's just not a system that works for anybody, right? That is a system that is incentivizing people to get a short-term visa and overstay or cross the border because they're not going to wait 20 years to do it, the right way, right? And what we have said for a long time is we need to create. People always say, well, people should get in line. If they got in line and they did it the right way, then they would support that. Well, there are not that many lines, and if you do get in lines, the lines take forever. So I think we just need a system where people are able to have a kind of streamlined process to come to the U.S. If they're not eligible to come to the U.S., then they can't. And if they're in the U.S. and they commit a crime, then they're removed. I think some of this is pretty simple, right? And there have been efforts to do some of these things. There have been efforts to change parts of the family-based system. There have been efforts to expand the employment-based system. And ultimately, all of that is going to reside in the Congress. And as we've discussed, they're kind of unable to come to a conclusion on some of these pieces. So there's a lot of work and a lot of thinking happening about how do we make an immigration system that makes people wait 10, 20, 30 years. How do we make that system better? And I'm happy to share some of that with you after this as well. But the work is being done. Those conversations are being had. And I think one day we'll get to a solution where our immigration system you can enter, you can apply, and you can arrive in a much shorter time frame for all people involved. A much shorter time frame than we have right now.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, I'd just like you to know that I admire you and respect you as an individual who is passionate about helping people and not just running for a status. And with that being said, I'd like two pressing points, and I need your opinion on them. And the first one is regarding the lack of care in the border from the government, and then showing immoral action by deporting people whom sold everything and sacrificed to get into America. And the second one is, would you hold or consider the government liable of human trafficking? Because as they know, they let individuals come to America who are undocumented and are very most vulnerable today in our society that could be in a dangerous situation at any time and any point.
Yeah, thank you for that. Important questions. Yeah, I think we've lost site in a lot of ways of, we've talked a lot about immigration in the last couple of years, a lot about what's happening on the border. But those are people who have made a pretty impossible decision to give up their lives wherever they are, and come to the United States, right? And that is a process that has taken weeks, months in many cases. They've traversed hundreds of miles. They've traversed probably multiple countries in most examples. They've gone through the jungle and the Darien Gap for the most part. And there is an incredibly high amount of violence, of rape, of immigrants who ultimately die trying to cross the border. And we probably don't spend enough time talking about those people and those stories. And I think it just like makes you want to double down on the case of like whether right or left, Republican or Democrat, like we need to have a system where we don't have people just like dying in the desert. We don't want a system where we have children being trafficked through the border. I mean, there was the story from a couple years ago of a truck in the summer driving through the border, and then there was an accident, and they found many people in the back of that truck who died in the accident because they were trying to be smuggled in. Like there's such a human dimension to the border crisis. We've lost sight of that, and I think too many people on the left and the right have tried to turn it into politics. On the left, there's too many. I think there's a lot of arguments about how the Trump administration there's no care for immigrants, and there's a callousness, which I think in a lot of ways is right. On the right, there have been arguments that there were more children trafficked in the last administration than ever before. And I think instead of trying to solve some of those issues, like everything is turned into politics, it's turned into an ad for a campaign. And at like some point, we need to recognize that like not only is immigration an opportunity, a great opportunity for this country to seize, but like it is an enormous problem to fix when there's such harm that have been done to so many different people in our immigration system on the border and also in the interior, that like people need to we need to come together and we need to get past this as a country. Like for too long we've used it as a way, right and left, to divide the country, and it's not worked out for people, and there's like a real human cost to that. So like let's like put all the politics and all the bullshit away, and like let's get to a solution. And the politics of the moment are still kind of winning out on that, and in many ways that results in death and in destruction on the border.
Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. That's loud. I wanted to take a second to say thank you for coming here and speaking to us today. My dad also works as a federal agent, so I know it's really crazy up in there right now. I also come to you with 2 questions. How is President Trump planning on compensating for ending the refugee process, and won't that affect our allyships with other countries? And what can we do to get people to change their perspective on immigration so we can work for beneficial immigration policies rather than harmful ones? I mean, we've taught history in school. Historically, Ellis Island helped the economic boom right before the Great Depression, so there's a history of it working. We've tried to empathize with people from a humanitarian standpoint, but people just fail to recognize that, so what can we do?
Yeah, big question. So I think what has happened in the last couple of years is immigration has just become a kind of law and order, public safety issue. I think people saw immigration through the lens of public safety, not of historical comparisons, not thinking about Ellis Island, not thinking about contributions, not thinking about, my doctor is foreign born, not thinking about some of these other questions. They saw it through, immigration is a threat and immigration is a problem through the lens of public safety and security. And I think you can't blame people for voting for wanting safety and security. And so I think the lesson that I come back to all the time from this election is like, you kind of need control and you need order in order to have welcoming. And I think that, as I said earlier, I think the American people are still in a place where they want to support immigration and immigrants. And I think that they're ready to get back there. But like, we have to be in control of our immigration system to get there. And I think once you kind of check that box, you like, public opinion is on your side, and we're in a different place when it comes to public sentiment about immigrants and about immigration. It's getting back there. How do we get back there? Which is the question. I don't think that mass deportation is the way to get back to control of our immigration system. To me, that's more chaos, chaos in a different form, but still chaos. But I think that that's the answer. I think that immigration became something else. It became a kind of a lever to pull when you feel like things have gone awry, and there's questions about public safety and security. And once you have that conversation with immigration, you've probably lost the thread on the opportunity, the benefit that immigration provides. On the resettlement question, the administration has tried to cut off all services for refugee serving organizations. There's litigation on that front. There's litigation on ending the refugee program. And there's litigation on stopping refugee organizations and providing benefits and services to refugees who have arrived here. So if you came here as a refugee in January, because of the executive order on refugee resettlement, the organization that helped resettle you, your case manager, was not able to provide services and benefits to you. So you just came here from a refugee camp, or you've been waiting somewhere outside the country, you arrive in the U.S., maybe you speak the language, maybe you don't, and then you were told you couldn't get services from refugee serving organizations. And what I've said is, like, you can have you can have a position on whether we should have a refugee program or not. We can argue about that. But the idea that we're going to tell refugees who have already arrived here, they're in the United States, they're legal, they're going to become citizens, that they can't get services, that it just seems cruel and unnecessary, and obviously is now the subject of the courts to determine if that is legal or not. So I don't think they're interested in restarting the refugee program, but as I was saying earlier, things can shift and things can change, and we never know when the next international crisis is, right? We wouldn't have said in 2010 that Syria was going to collapse. We wouldn't have said that 4 years ago, that 3 years ago this week, that there'd be a crisis in Ukraine that would drive something like 10 million people out of the country, right? Like, we never know that tomorrow there is another crisis, and immigration is something in the toolkit that the federal government can use to address a crisis. Well, people are in need. We want to stand with our allies. We want to oppose our rivals. And when we cut off all these immigration opportunities and all these programs, we're just like throwing away the opportunity to use that as a lever in the future. We have no idea what crisis is coming. There's always something happening in the world, and immigration's a way to respond to that. And when you get rid of that, you're kind of cutting off an opportunity to do that.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I would like to say first, thank you for speaking on such an important topic. So recently, the official White House Instagram has been posting posts, including an ASMR video of immigrants getting deported. How do you believe such videos impact the public's point of view on immigrants and the overall discourse of the immigration policy? And what can be done to address the dehumanizing effects of such behavior that has received a lot of backlash and seen by many as unprofessional, as this country was built by immigrants?
Yeah, so for those who are unaware, the White House put out an ASMR video about a migrant like being handcuffed and deported. It's kind of a preposterous, gross, unnecessary like PR stunt to show that they're cracking down on immigrants and deporting people. Obviously it's ridiculous and dehumanizing. It's one of those things like the resettlement argument I was just talking about. If you support deporting criminals and you support mass deportation, there's a kind of a way to go about that and a kind of policy case for why you'd want to do that. The idea that we're going to have the White House Instagram account be doing like they're trying to do like a documentary about like their mass deportations as a way to both instill fear in people and also like show that they're tough. It's like not amateur, because that is like it's like not giving it enough credit, but it's ridiculous. And the administration can focus their resources on other things than making Instagram videos. And I mean, I don't know how you, like, I think that shows how far we've come in this conversation. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to the ASMR video of the deportation. Like, it's so preposterous on its face, and hopefully most people didn't see that, and it was self-serving for the kind of base of White House support. But that tax dollars are going to fund videos like that is just preposterous.
Thank you.
Hi. I just want to say thank you for coming. It's very informative, especially with all the jumble of like news lately and everything. Kind of straining away from politics, you spoke about how you're optimistic and very passionate about this topic. As someone who also wants to go into a very emotional and heavy career path, how do you separate these emotional issues from your everyday life and stay like optimistic?
Ooh,
Tough question.
that's a tough one. Yeah, I think there is a lot of heaviness. I think that's true. I think sometimes you maybe need to separate yourself a little bit from it in order to move forward. But sometimes you kind of have to embrace it to understand the severity. But I think the way to stay optimistic is to just keep talking to people, and you talk to people and you kind of hear things on the Hill, and you hear things from Republicans, and you hear things from Democrats. They're like, okay, there is like there's something here, and I don't really know what it is, and there's some, it's like, how do we take vibes of bipartisanship and turn it into a thing? And like, I don't know how to do that, but it's motivating to want to do that. And then the other thing, if you're involved in anything that you think is heavy or whatnot, is just like having things outside of work. For me, it's like the Hofstra basketball team this year has been a little heavy, but it's like finding things that are, my cat and things like that. And I encourage everybody, if you're involved in work that you think is heavy, or if there's stress or anxiety, like, to find other things outside of the thing that is, whether it's school or it's work or it's a passion project or whatever, and be able to kind of find ways to take time off of the thing that you're thinking about. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Dr. Labresca.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks so much. That's wonderful. So I'm Andrea Labresco, and I have my civic engagement class here with me. So I have a sort of two-part question. One is a very sort of granular, practical question. What does your day-to-day life look like as somebody who's working at a think tank and working on this issue? That's part one. And then the subsection of this is, to what extent do you end up working in other issues that connect to yours? And one of the ones I'm thinking of when we're talking about failing immigration deals, you got to think about gerrymandering as a reason for that, and that there's very red districts that will never come around on this issue. And Rosanna, I think, was sort of alluding to that, talking about sort of intransigent groups that aren't going to move. So I wonder the extent to which your work involves working on what you might think of as ancillary issues but are quite connected. I'll sit down for my answer. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't do a lot of other work. I've dabbled here and there, but for the most part, it is like 100% immigration all the way. That's not to say that other colleagues are not working on other larger issues of democracy and whatnot. But I have stayed maybe too niche, but I've stayed really in the immigration kind of wheelhouse. On the like day to day, I think everybody's day to day really changed with the pandemic. My day to day was like be in the office 5 days a week, and I would go to the Hill probably 3 days a week to meet with the staff of people in Congress. I have moved out of DC. I live in North Carolina now, and so going to the Hill is not something that I do in person anymore, until I'm going to DC tomorrow for a trip. But for the most part, my day to day is kind of like this. I'm having a lot of meetings internally with our team on all the things that they're working on. So somebody is working on this intersection of diplomacy, foreign policy, and immigration. What does that look like? We have an economist on staff that's running numbers and trying to analyze, well, if we do X policy, what's the impact to GDP? We have somebody who works on the Hill as our lobbyist. Who is she talking to and what is she hearing? I'm kind of collecting all this information, and how does it relate to our larger work, and what are we not doing at the moment that we could be doing? I'm always trying to think what could we, where's the gap? And how do we fill the gap? And so I'm doing a lot of that. And then there's a lot of that externally. So you're meeting with coalitions, you're meeting with other partners, you're meeting with folks on the Hill. There's what you read about in the news every day. Oh, this executive order was signed. And then there's so much conversation that's happening that is not being reported. It's just what are people hearing that's coming out of the Department of Homeland Security? What are people thinking about this hearing that's happening on the Hill next week? Who is testifying in front of that hearing? You're just kind of corralling as much information as possible, so you're able to make decisions on where should we spend resources, and what should we be doing, and what should we be leaving to others to work on. And so I'm doing a lot of talking and listening in my day to day, whether on Zoom in North Carolina, whether in DC, in front of people. And then I still get to dabble in some writing and some policy work, which I love, but I just I don't do as much of. But one blog post a month is kind of where I'd like to be, and that's a fun. You get to kind of use that muscle that you don't normally use, and putting things out into the world feels good when you write something. And there's something in there that's new and original, and you share it, and you get feedback from it. It's very rewarding work, so I still like to try to write every now and then as well.
Matthew, if I can pick up on a policy question from what you raised. You spoke about the need for control and order. I think that was the first question, right? About how to make the process of immigration more efficient, more seamless, kind of one-stop shopping. George W. Bush in 2001 proposed a guest worker program. It didn't go very far. It wasn't very popular. It was seen as kind of a second-tier citizenship. But the country hasn't moved toward immigration reform. If anything, we've moved further away, right? Each year you have the Secure Fences Act. You have multiple efforts at enforcement. The Lake and Riley Act that just passed due to the horrific events in 2024 in Georgia, Lake and Riley's killing. Is the price of achieving a welcoming immigration environment going to be something like a guest worker program for people who cross the border without going through the legal process? Yeah,
great question. Part of the conversations that we're having. A great little footnote lost to history is the week of 9/11. There was a planned markup of a Bush guest worker bill with bipartisan support. Obviously, that was canceled, and the kind of country moved on to other things. But there was a real opening in 2000, 2001 on immigration reform, guest workers being a big piece of that, and guest workers being this idea that there are people who want to come here for work, in most of the case for agricultural work. We can let them come here. They're here for let's say 6 months, and then they can go back home, wherever home is, and then they continue to come back. We know who they are. They're vetted and screened. They work, and then they leave. And it seems like that's a system that would work well. We have versions of guest worker programs for ag under the H-2A program, and then non-agricultural, the H-2B program. There's so many acronyms, it's alphabet soup. But there have been many efforts, written a couple years ago in a bipartisan way, to say like the agricultural workforce in the United States is a very high percentage is undocumented. Obviously, we need to make sure that the agricultural workforce in this country continues. We all have interest in making sure that U.S. food supply remains plentiful. Cutting 50% of the staff, of the agricultural sector would be a catastrophe. And so there's been a lot of interest in like, okay, we can create a program structured around agricultural workers, which have bipartisan support, Republicans in rural areas as well. And we can sort of give them a status, bring them out of the shadows, make them pay taxes, make them prove that they know English, and then give them a status, and then they will be regularized or legalized. And those conversations got really far a couple years ago. And I think there's always interest in that as a piece. I think if we're doing comprehensive immigration reform, we're doing enforcement, we're doing border, we're doing asylum, legalization at some level has to be that, whether it's DACA or it's agricultural. I think the idea of not doing a citizenship, of giving a legal status, temporary legal status, whether that's a guest worker program, whether it's a 5-year renewable visa, something like that, I think it's part of the equation. There's just too many people working in too many industries that are reliant on undocumented labor. And one of the interesting things we're going to see is like if we're going to really move forward with mass deportation, and we're going to start doing raids on agricultural employers, on construction, hospitality, tourism, those sectors are enormous, and I think we all rely a lot on those sectors of the economy. Mass deportation could have really enormous implications for the price of a house or the price of groceries. And I think there's an economic case against why you'd want to deport those people. But like, how do we give those people some sort of a status? We don't want them to be undocumented. How do we give them a status? You're going to have some sort of a process. Yeah. But it's a complicated question. But I think it has to be part of the solution, no matter what we do.
We are almost out of time. I want to just take a moment and thank Matthew for sharing his expertise, his time, his dedication to public service. I can't think of a better illustration of what the mission of the Kalikow School, Peter Kalikow, who's a Hofstra alum, when we created this in 2015, right after you graduated, but we knew you'd come back, to bridge the study of politics and policymaking with the practice. And I know many people in this room plan to pursue those careers. I think we've all learned a lot today, and we appreciate you, Matthew, coming back and always your unending generosity of time and offer to work with students. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
In 4 weeks from today, we will have a panel assessing the early Trump administration. It is not quite at the 100-day mark, but I think it's fair to say there's more that's happened in the past month than in many 100 days. So that'll be Tuesday, March 25th in Monroe, and more advertised on that soon. Thank you very much, everyone.